So, I have been tracking my food every single day, every single thing that I've eaten, every single calorie that I've eaten, more or less, for the past 2 years. Here's how that has changed my life, changed my physique, changed my entire approach to fitness. So, to start off, basically some context. For the longest time, I was a power lifter. I focused really hard on my training. I did not really want to think too much about my diet. I think that's pretty common for a lot of powerlifter types. I generally found that, I would eat a decent amount of protein, wouldn't worry too much about the quality of my food, would eat a lot of junk food. And, I would gain a little bit of weight over time, but generally it seemed fine. I was generally in good shape, had a lot of muscle mass, and so on. So, I was seeing my strength numbers go up, I was seeing my muscle mass increase, so that felt all very good, I didn't have any real sort of affinity for the whole, bodybuilding type approach, just didn't really interest me, wasn't really something I wanted to get into, didn't really want to get into that fine of manipulation of my diet. So things did start to shift and change a little bit a few years ago. So obviously, there were a few major catalysts here. One was basically just that I started to see some minor issues in terms of my blood pressure, in terms of my health. And I come from a family where my father has very high blood pressure as well. And that's why he started, getting into fitness when he was later in life. And that was kind of what helped me get into fitness when I was a teenager. So at the same time, that's something I want to keep an eye on. So I started kind of shifting my training and focusing a bit more on muscle mass, a bit less on strength. Focusing a little bit more on the cardio, but I still wasn't really changing my diet too much. Still didn't really want to do any of that. So then obviously a lot of things happened. Pandemic happened. I shifted to doing a lot of gymnastics style training. I wanted to focus on losing some weight, basically just so that it would be easier to do a lot of these body weight style movements. And, at the time I kind of tried out a lot of different things. I tried out MyFitnessPal. Obviously don't really like it. Tried out a lot of different tracking methods. Tried basically just kind of focusing on upping my protein a lot and, just kind of minimizing my carbs. And that kind of helped a bit. I did lose a little bit of weight, but, nothing that really worked out that I knew what wasn't really going to work out because I just really wasn't that committed to it. Wasn't really finding sort of a method that I liked. So obviously a lot of that changed when I started using MacroFactor when it released. MacroFactor is a macro tracking program that has a lot of features that make it very useful, very easy to use. And in addition, it has something that's kind of very cool, which is that it has an algorithm which basically changes over time to show you, basically how your expenditure changes, and it adjusts your calories accordingly, which is something that's not really offered in any of the other really, major diet apps, not in the same way. Basically, the one thing with MacroFactor that's very important is that you give it accurate data, and that you give it accurate data as much as possible. Ideally, you're giving it data 7 days a week, every single week. You don't have to give it quite that much data, but you do need to give it quite a lot of data, and you need to be pretty accurate with the data that you give it to ensure that you are not throwing off the calculations. Basically what it does is it reflects your numbers back to you and tells you, okay, based on the numbers you've given me, here's what your expenditure must be. So if you give it bad numbers, it's going to give you a bad expenditure calculation, and that's going to mean that obviously you're not seeing the results you're looking for at the same rate. Big focus there on basically just ensuring that I'm tracking everything pretty consistently, pretty accurately. And it's also the first app where I found that I really got out of it something that I was looking to get out of it, as opposed to having to do a lot of sort of work on the side to kind of do the same thing. So, in a typical something like MyFitnessPal, you have to do a lot of work on the side, being like, okay, based on that, and I'm not losing weight at this rate, so I'm going to have to reduce my calories further. And, there's a lot of work on the side. MacroFactor does a lot of that work for you, which is a very magical experience. Again, just adjust your calories automatically from week to week. So that makes it very easy to just be like, I don't even have to think about it. I just track things, it tells me what to eat, and then I adjust my calories accordingly, and it's great. Basically started using MacroFactor roughly about 2 years ago on its launch. It's not actually quite up to 2 years. It's something like 670 days, which means obviously that I'm going to be hitting the 2-year mark within a couple months. But yes, I've been using it basically nonstop since then, and I have an unbroken nutrition tracking streak the entire time, which means that I've not missed a single day. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the lessons I've drawn from this, my approach, how to get the most out of it, and so on. So the first thing to get out of the way is simply that obviously I'm not really perfectly tracking every single thing that I eat. A lot of people are not really aware of just basically how much of an inherently error-filled process macro tracking is, and that's something that becomes very frustrating for them. So when you are tracking your macros very precisely, The reality is that, say, you get the nutrition value for an apple, and that's going to be sort of the nutrition value for an average apple, right? It's not going to be the nutrition value for that specific apple that you have, because they don't have the ability to measure every single apple for the exact size and so on. What they can do is they can measure a bunch of different apples. They can get a rough sense of like, okay, here's what the average, calorie macros per gram is, etc. And then they can tell you that. And then, obviously, if you want to get extra precise on things, you could weigh out exactly how much apple you're eating. And then, you get your macros even more precise versus just saying I'm eating, an apple and hopefully it's an average sized apple. But even then, like nobody wants to whip out the scale every single time for every single little thing. So very often, if you're tracking, you're just going to say, you know what, I'm just going to assume this is an average sized apple. I'm just going to eat it anyway. Does that mean that my tracking is maybe slightly inaccurate? Yes, but it's generally fine, because these, it creates all these tiny little minor errors, but they tend to cancel each other out or really not add up to much of anything. And that's kind of the important thing. It's like just, making those little adjustments, those little tweaks that you need to do to make this sustainable for you, as opposed to kind of like just driving yourself absolutely up the wall, trying to like measure every single little thing, and then being like, I can't, go out to the restaurant because I can't weigh, however much food I'm getting and all that. And that brings us to another point, which is basically that there's going to be a lot of times that you can't really track accurately. So it's very easy to track foods accurately when you are at home, when you're cooking for yourself. And, again, when you have like a scale on hand, you can measure things exactly. I don't even bother using the scale a lot of times. I do things like, okay, I've made this family dinner. I'm going to eat roughly a quarter of it. I'm going to say that my macros are roughly a quarter of what went into this dinner, even though that's obviously not going to end up very precise, especially if, it ends up that like I end up eating a little bit more, a little bit less than a quarter, and so on. And that's very normal. Again, works totally fine, not something to worry too much about. But say you go to a restaurant, you're like, hey, I don't even know how many calories this thing is. It's not on the menu. Definitely feels like a lot of food. Yes, there are certain times where you just have to estimate. You just have to say like, hey, I think that was, maybe 1,000 calories, maybe 1,200 calories. I'm just going to say it is. Maybe that's not quite accurate, but that's what I have to do because, again, I don't really have any better options right now. There's a lot of parts of tracking that are very inherently error-filled, and you just kind of have to roll with it. That's, pretty natural. The other thing that I would say that I've really learned, especially with tracking in general, is just that there are going to be times where you kind of have these ups and downs in motivation and in terms of sort of like how much you're pushing for a goal and so on. So one of the cool things about Macro Factor is it lets you select what your goal is specifically. So you can say, okay, I want to gain weight, I want to lose weight, or I want to maintain weight. And obviously there are going to be times where it's like, hey, I'm in a weight loss phase, but it's Christmas and I'm certainly not gonna, I'm certainly gonna go off track. That's fine. Or, there's gonna be times where it's like, hey, I'm in a gain phase, but I just really don't have the energy to eat all these calories today. And so I'm just not gonna. There are gonna be those times where you just don't feel up to it. There's gonna be times where especially when you are, say for example, in the very low stages of a weight loss phase, you're just like, this, doesn't feel good. I just want to be able to eat to maintenance today, and that's fine. The way that Macro Factor handles that is it just says okay, you ate at maintenance for a day. That basically just means that, we push out the expected end date by a day, and that's fine. For most people, you don't need to be, hitting a particular weight within a particular time frame. So it's generally just a lot, mentally healthier to just say okay, you know what, I'm going to take an extra week off of my diet. Yes, that's going to add, a week to the back end of how long this is going to take, but that's well worth it because it makes this a lot more sustainable for me in particular. Initially, when I started using the app, I wanted to use it to focus on losing weight. I wanted to cut down to about 70 kilos, and I did that, essentially. I got to around 71 kilos. I did get to a point at around 71 kilos where I was just kind of I'd been in a diet phase for a long time. I was really struggling to stick to the amount of calories that I needed to eat. And I was seeing, relatively slow progress as a result. And it was starting to impact me a little bit psychologically. It was starting to impact, my family as a result as well. And it was something where, what I ultimately had to do is I just had to say, it's not worth it to keep, pushing this further. I look great, I feel great, but, I need to, pull off. I need to, I need to go back to a healthy, sort of relationship with food, and this is starting to stray out of that. So there do need to be times where you need to say hey, I know that I had, sort of aimed for this particular number, but, I'm just going to cut it there because this is not, getting healthy. I need to pull back, I need to reassess, I need to reevaluate, and so on. There are certainly going to be times that you want to keep tracking, but just do a maintenance phase. Basically just stick to like, hey, I'm just gonna, eat, I'm just gonna train, I'm gonna feel good about it, but I'm not gonna worry too much about manipulating my calories and so on. There are going to be phases where, again, you don't feel like tracking at all. It's totally fine to take some time off here and there. Ultimately, I have been tracking nonstop for 2 years, but that's not to say that that should be, your specific use case either. Certainly, I have continued tracking while on vacation, through holidays, through birthdays, that sort of thing. And, depending on your use case, you may not find that very sustainable. I generally don't find it too much of a difficulty, but again, that's not everybody, right? There is sort of this there's this sort of thought that tracking has to be specifically about manipulating your diet, manipulating your body mass all the time. And I would just say, give yourself permission to say at times, yes, I'm going to keep tracking, but not going to follow my targets. I'm not going to, follow a particular goal. I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'm just tracking so that I have this data and so that it's not, as psychologically difficult for me. And I do find that obviously, at this point, I have now been tracking again for 2 years. It's so easy for me. It takes seconds. It's almost no friction whatsoever. Sometimes, I might forget to log a few things. I'm like, okay, I'm just munching on these chips or whatever. And then I forget to log them for 6 hours and then I log them later in the day or whatever. But, it is what it is. There are going to be times where, you are, up in terms of your motivation, in terms of being on top of everything. There's going to be times that you're down. And the main thing there is not to get beat up about it. It is certainly a skill. I think it's a skill, people don't think about it as a skill. People don't think about it as, sort of something that they, they're going to have mistakes with, they're going to practice, they're going to get better over time. Tracking is not something that's for everybody either, obviously. There are a lot of people for whom tracking of any kind is potentially likely to exacerbate, potentially eating disordered issues. And for those kinds of people, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't even touch it. Move on, right? For other people for whom this kind of thing can be healthy and you can have a good relationship with it, obviously, again, you start off, it's going to feel weird. It's going to feel like you don't quite get it. It's going to feel like you're making a lot of mistakes, but over time you will practice, you will improve, you will get better. And it also becomes, something where you get better about kind of understanding if I eat this now, then that means I, probably shouldn't eat this other thing later. Or, oh, you know what, I've got a day coming up that's going to definitely be a day that I'm off track. So I want to make sure that I kind of, maybe save up a few calories before that. For example, just you get to know okay, what's a high protein food? What are good high protein sources that I enjoy that I can use to hit my protein targets and so on. You start to have a sense of how you can hit all the targets that you want to hit, sort of in the least stressful, the least energy, the least energy draining way possible. And that all comes with time, obviously, right? It's not something that, comes, right away. It takes time. I started off, again, this was really my first time seriously tracking. Certainly I would say that, I was having a lot of trouble with it for, say, the first 3 to 6 months. Over time, you get better at it, you get more practice, it becomes natural to you, it becomes easier, and it gets to the point where, again, now, I've got almost a 2-year streak, and it's second nature to me. It takes me 10 seconds to log something, and then I close the app and I move on with my day, and it feels great. If I need to check my data, because I'm I wonder how things have been going recently, then maybe I spend a little bit more time in the app, but that's about it. That's kind of the beauty of the thing, right? A good tracking app is an app that, you use it for a little bit, and then you put it down, you don't have to think about it. It does not take a significant amount of time in your day, it does not take a significant amount of mental effort. I initially started using the app to lose weight, to lean out. Initially just to kind of get, a little bit leaner for sort of this gymnastics, calisthenics training phase I was doing. Then I just decided, okay, screw it. I'm going to get as lean as I possibly can, see what that looks like. That was the first time I've ever been that lean. It was awesome. Felt great. Also felt not great, obviously, in terms of the negative effects of, being in a deficit for a long time. But then pulled back from that, shifted to maintenance for a little while. Since then, I've been on a very slow bulk. Another sort of thing that the app teaches you is that bulking, an efficient, optimal bulk is a lot slower than people tend to think. Since then, I've been bulking. I want to get back up to essentially the weight that I was, 90 kilos, before I started all this. Obviously, a lot leaner body composition, and basically just see how strong I can get, how big I can get at sort of the weight that I was at previously. And then of course, gonna shift back down, cut down again, kind of find a weight more like, maybe 80 or so, maybe around 75 that I think is a lot more sustainable. And also like just, a little bit on the leaner side generally. And obviously that's gonna help in terms of, again, just supporting having, better blood pressure, better health markers, and so on. So I hope that this episode has been helpful to folks. I know obviously that tracking is something that a lot of people are not, super sold on. It seems like a lot of work. It seems like, maybe it's not going to work, or it's just going to be stressful and it's just going to exacerbate things. But it can work, obviously, person to person, depending on sort of just what your approach is, what you need out of it, and so on. And the number one piece of advice that I can give people is obviously just be compassionate to yourself, learn from your mistakes, don't beat yourself up about it. As always, smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, smash the notification bell, comment down below, let me know what you would like to see in future videos. I will talk to you all next week. Have a good one.